Hey guys! Last week we stepped into the eerie practice of funerals and why we find comfort in some of the ways we prepare our loved ones for their eternal rest. From coins for the passage through the underworld to sin eaters, it's not surprising why traditions of death have carried on for so many generations and across so many cultures. Sometimes it's better to make sure that those who are dead stay that way. Welcome back, spooky souls, to another episode of Let's Talk Spooky. I'm your host, Shauna, and this week we're going into part 2 of our funeral customs and superstitions episode. So if you're just joining us, I do recommend going back to last week's episode and listening to part 1 first. If you've just stumbled upon our little community of spookies, welcome. This podcast explores the eerie space where folklore, urban legend, and haunted history come together. If that's something you're interested in hearing more of, click the follow button wherever you listen to your podcast. It helps us grow, and it brings more creepy content weekly. Also, I'd love to hear where you guys are from, so drop a comment. Tonight, we're stepping onto sacred ground. We're pulling back the black veil and uncovering the strange and chilling and downright terrifying customs and superstitions that surround burial. Because in many traditions, death isn't the end. No, it's something we must manage carefully, or else we risk it coming back for us. So light a candle, cover your mirrors, and let's talk spooky. The idea of being buried alive is known as taphophobia, and it's a real and widespread panic that plagued most of Europe and parts of North America during the 18th and 19th century. This wasn't just an irrational fear either. It was based on actual cases and a deep mistrust for early medicine and the ability to accurately declare someone dead. In fact, it's documented by Dr. Samuel Glass in 1789 that up to 10% of people in England might have been buried prematurely. But for Irish-born Marjorie McCall, it was more than just a fear. It became her reality. Having been declared dead by doctors after suffering a long stint of high fevers, Marjorie's body was prepared quickly for burial, which in this era wasn't uncommon due to how quickly and easily diseases spread. Having been a woman of means, Marjorie was buried with some of her most valuable possessions, including a very large and very expensive ring. Now, it's not certain who shared the contents of Marjorie's coffin. I imagine it was maybe over a cup of ale at the local tavern after the funeral. But the word did reach 2 very eager grave robbers. And that night, Marjorie's fresh grave was dug up and her coffin was opened to reveal an unmoved Marjorie. The grave robbers got to work quickly, but after some effort, they could not remove the large ring from her finger. So, they did the next best thing. They attempted to cut her finger off, and that's when the unthinkable happened. Marjorie screamed. She had not been dead after all, merely in a coma, which was easily mistaken for death at the time. The terrified grave robbers fled in horror, leaving the open grave behind. Now, from this point, the remainder of the story becomes mostly local legend. Many say that Marjorie climbed out of her grave, walked home, still in her burial shroud, and when her husband saw her at the door, he either fainted or dropped dead. I'll let you decide. But from then on, she was known as Lived Once, Buried Twice McCall. So the very real fear of being buried alive initiated some interesting precautions. And I would say that some of them may have helped, but they were mostly there to make people feel better about the potential of burying their loved ones alive. We talked about one last week, the wake, which allowed a person enough time to potentially wake up. In most cases, where hasty burial was needed, there wasn't enough time to wait. Graveside inventions were placed to aid in the escape if the unimaginable were to happen, and the buried woke up. Some examples of this included bells, flags, or whistles attached by a string to the buried person's hand. If an individual woke up underground, they could essentially ring the bell and hope that someone was close enough to hear them. This wasn't a foolproof way. We know in many cases dead bodies do move due to rigor mortis. So there was a chance that the dead were still actually dead. But it did create a fun phrase that we use quite often today, and you might know it as saved by the bell. Other precautions did include breathing tubes in coffins, and in countries such as Germany and Austria, waiting mortuaries were put into place. These were open buildings that the dead were put into and waited until signs of decay were present. But what if the dead not being dead wasn't your biggest concern? What if it was much darker? Let's follow the burial shrouds a little farther to a place where death wasn't just mourned, it was feared, where communities didn't trust the graves to hold what they had placed inside them. In the shadowy forest and forgotten villages of Eastern Europe, particularly in the Slavic regions, folklore taught us that death could be temporary, and not in a comforting, spiritual way, but in a terrifying, flesh and blood, dig yourself out of the grave kind of way. And no, we're not talking about your typical fear of a ghost showing up at your bedroom window. We're talking about a revenant, a corpse that walked. In 1336, in the small Czech village, a shepherd by the name of Myslata passed away from what was deemed natural causes. He was buried like anyone else in a consecrated ground, beneath earth and stone, and with prayers whispered over his body. But peace didn't last long. Just a few nights after his burial, villagers began to speak in hushed voices. They claimed that they had seen something, or rather, someone. A figure wandering near homes after dark, a man in burial clothing, pale, bloodless, but still standing, walking, speaking, and they believed it was Myslata. Witnesses even reported that he would stop in the street and speak out loud to those nearby, as if holding casual conversation with them. But there was nothing casual about it, because anyone he did speak to was said to have died within 8 days after the conversation took place. For obvious reasons, panic spread throughout the village. This was no ghost. This was no mere nightmare. This was a reanimated dead that was walking among the living and killing by name. Terrified, the villagers called for help from neighboring towns, and together they exhumed Myslata's grave under the moonlight, armed with tools, stakes, and prayers. What they found chilled them to the bone. As they unearthed his coffin, they heard a sound, a guttural scream, loud and unnatural, that tore through the night. Myslata's corpse cried out as if it was still alive and aware of the intrusion upon it. One villager drove a stake deep into his chest, and from the wound gashed unnatural amounts of blood, so much so, in fact, that one villager described it as from a slain ox it did pour forth. In Slavic folklore, this was a sign, the final confirmation that this was no longer a man, no innocent corpse, but the undead creature feeding off the living. If you thought they were done there, the villagers burned the body until there was nothing remaining but ash and bone. And then the terror ended. This story was recorded in 14th century chronicles by Abbat Jean Nakip and repeated by others for centuries, not as a fairy tale, but as a testimony. Because the people of Bohemia, revenants weren't just folklore or stories told by firelight. They were real threats. And if the only way to be sure someone was truly dead was to dig them up and see, then so be it. And burning the body, well, that was just for good measure. Now, if you felt that the revenant was familiar in some way, that it derived from our modern-day vampire, which we will be going a little deeper into that lore in future episodes. This last burial tradition, we are going to travel a little further to the region of Brazil, particularly, and I really apologize if I butcher this, but Santre Mauá of Brazil, where there's a ritual of burial traditions that will absolutely send chills down your spine. Among the Santre Mauá people of Brazil, death isn't the end of a person's presence in the home, but more the beginning of a transition period, a fragile, dangerous moment where the living must walk the line between grief and obedience of the dead. Because if they don't, the spirit might never leave. And so when someone dies, particularly a spouse, the surviving partner is expected to remain with the body, not for an hour or a quiet farewell moment, but for an entire night. They are expected to sleep beside the corpse, wrapped in a blanket, laid side by side on a woven mat. The living and the dead share one final night together, not out of love, but out of fear. The belief is simple and deeply rooted. If the soul of the departed feels abandoned, and if it senses that the living is trying to hurry them away, it may grow angry or confused, or choose to stay behind, haunting the home and spreading illness throughout the family. So, the one closest to the deceased must watch over the body, lay with it, and submit to the silence, to prove their devotion, or at least to keep the spirit from becoming vengeful. There's no embalming, no cooling. In the jungle heat, the body changes quickly. The skin stiffens, the air thickens, and insects do begin to gather quickly. But the ritual remains, because that's the price you pay for peace, for closure, and for a clean break between this world and whatever comes after. It doesn't stop there. In some tribal variations, the body remains inside the home for days, surrounded by family members who continue to talk to it, feed it, and leave offerings, as if daring the spirit to feel unwanted in the home. Anthropologists such as Alcida Ramos have extensively studied Amazonian indigenous traditions and noted that these practices reflect a collective responsibility. Keeping vigil is understood as an essential, ensuring a safe passage from the living world to the spirit realm, and preventing the dead from lingering too long, becoming harmful, or worse, lost. In other traditions, corpse oil was used as an ointment for the living. Open graves were left exposed overnight to give the dead a choice, to leave peacefully or return with vengeance. To outsiders, this might seem unsettling, but within the folklore of the forest, it holds a deep and spiritual meaning to the people. According to traditional beliefs of the area, the soul doesn't instantly depart the body. It lingers near, watching, listening, sensing how the living respond to its absence. This soul, in some oral traditions, can be called by name that reflects its dual nature, not yet spirit and not yet flesh. Still bound to the world of the living and uncertain exactly how to leave. And if that soul feels forgotten, senses fear, haste, or neglect, it may refuse to move on, and it may even choose to stay. Amazonian and Brazilian folklore teach us that what lies between death and burial is a vulnerable, volatile space where the soul must be accompanied, soothed, and gently encouraged to go. Historically, the worldview shaped how entire communities approach death. There's no separation between sacred and everyday. The soul's journey was everyone's responsibility, and so death rituals were communal, slow, and deeply symbolic. Some would chant, others would burn sacred resin, and close kin might sleep near the body, not from despair, but to show the spirit that they're not alone in this journey. If you think about it, it's kind of beautiful. I do have one last creepy story right out of Brazil that might make you understand why laying with the dead was such an important practice. In 2018, in the quiet town of Ribeirão das Neves, Brazil, a woman by the name of Rosângela Almeida dos Santos, who was 37, was known by neighbors as gentle, kind, but often unwell. For years she struggled with fainting spells and weakness, until one day her body seemed to give out. Doctors diagnosed her with a form of septic shock. The family signed the papers, and the mourning process began. Rosângela was laid to rest in a concrete tomb at a local cemetery. But what happened next will leave a scar on the town that still lingers today. 11 days after her funeral, visitors to the cemetery heard something strange. It sounded like knocking. They followed the sound until they stood directly in front of Rosângela's tomb. And what they heard was truly horrifying. A woman's voice, faint, pleading, crying for help within her sealed tomb. They called for her family and the local authorities, and within an hour, the tomb was cracked open. What they had found inside was the remnants of not a peaceful burial, but a horrifying one. The lining of the coffin had been shredded from within. Rosângela's forehead was bruised from repeated impact, and her nails were torn to the flesh and bloodied, as though she had clawed her way through the wood for hours. And the most chilling part was the inside of her coffin was still warm. Rosângela had been buried alive. This story made headlines across Brazil, but it echoed something far more older. For centuries, people feared this fate, waking in the dark, trapped, and forgotten. It haunted Victorian Europe so much so that they built safety coffins with bells and escape latches. They kept bodies above ground for days, just to make sure the soul had left. But this wasn't the 18th century England. This was 21st century Brazil. And in Rosângela's case, it woke an old fear that left us asking, how many others might have stirred in silence? How many tombs were sealed a moment too soon? So from across jungles, old villages, and cobblestone cemeteries, one thing remains the same. We've never trusted death to stay where it belongs. Not truly. The fear we whisper about in folklore still echoes in today, in almost everything we do, from the mundane to the downright strange. So until next time, keep those mirrors covered, mind the whispers at night, and never answer when the dead come knocking. And as always, stay safe, stay curious, and stay spooky. This episode was written and produced by me, Shauna. Sources and additional research can be found in the show notes below. If you have your own eerie tale or hometown haunting, and you want to share it with us, email us at letstalkspookypodcast@gmail.com, or follow us on Let's Talk Spooky on Instagram and Let's Talk Spooky Pod on TikTok. Until next time, stay spooky.